Careful, people would think we're together. Graham Mercer said it with the kind of crooked smile people used when they wanted to make a moment disappear before it became real. The woman beside him didn't laugh. She simply stopped walking. The late October breeze carried a handful of golden maple leaves across the brick sidewalk between them. Behind them, the neighborhood coffee shop buzzed with the familiar Saturday morning rhythm, parents pushing strollers, cyclists waiting for their drinks, an elderly couple sharing a newspaper by the window. Natalie Rowan looked at Graham for a long second. She wasn't offended. She wasn't embarrassed. If anything, she looked curious. Then the corner of her mouth lifted. Would that be bad? For the first time that morning, Graham didn't know what to say. His hand instinctively tightened around the cardboard tube holding a set of architectural drawings. He glanced toward the street instead of at her. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone across the road laughed. The silence between them suddenly felt louder than the traffic. If you're watching this, tell me your age, where you're watching from, and whether you've ever found yourself in a moment that changed everything with just one unexpected question. Graham finally cleared his throat. We should get back before your board starts wondering where their CEO disappeared to. Natalie smiled again, but this time she let the subject go. For someone who restores old buildings, she said as they crossed toward the historic courthouse, you spend a surprising amount of energy avoiding things worth keeping. She walked ahead before he could answer. Graham watched her disappear through the courthouse gates, then released a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That conversation should have lasted 10 seconds. Instead, it stayed with him for the rest of the day. The problem wasn't that Natalie Rowan was attractive. She was. It wasn't that she was the CEO of Rowan Urban Development, one of the fastest-growing redevelopment firms in the Midwest. That part barely mattered to him. The real problem was simpler. Every important relationship in his life had begun with good intentions. Not all of them had survived reality. 3 years earlier, after losing his wife, Graham had quietly rebuilt a life around things he could actually control. His 12-year-old daughter. His small architectural restoration studio. His aging pickup truck that refused to die. The Tuesday dinners he never canceled. The Saturday mornings he always reserved for Lila, no matter how busy a project became. Everything else was optional. Including happiness. Especially happiness. His phone buzzed. Dad? Lila's cheerful voice filled the speaker before he could say hello. Please tell me you didn't forget. He smiled despite himself. The art fair. And? I'm already on my way. You promised you'd judge my sculpture before anybody else sees it. I remember. You always remember, she said proudly. He looked once toward the courthouse where Natalie had disappeared. Then he turned in the opposite direction. Some distances, Graham believed, weren't measured in miles. They were measured in choices. And he had spent 3 years becoming very good at making the safe ones. The following Tuesday began the way most Tuesdays did in Graham Mercer's world, before sunrise and with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before he remembered to drink it. His workshop sat inside a renovated warehouse on the edge of Riverton's historic district, where old brick buildings had survived long enough to become fashionable again. The faded sign above the entrance simply read Mercer Restoration Studio, painted by hand years ago by Graham and his late wife, Hannah. He had considered replacing it more than once. Somehow he never had. Inside, shelves held weathered blueprints, carved wood samples, and rows of carefully labeled hardware salvaged from buildings older than anyone still living in town. Graham believed every old structure deserved at least one person willing to remember how it had originally been built. The business wasn't large. 4 employees, 1 drafting room, and a workshop that always smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. It was enough. More importantly, it allowed him to leave every afternoon before 4. That wasn't negotiable. Dad! Lila burst through the side entrance wearing a denim jacket covered with tiny embroidered paintbrushes. Her blonde ponytail bounced as she hurried toward him carrying a sketchbook almost as thick as a phone book. I only have 12 minutes before school. So you've told me 3 times. Because 12 minutes isn't very long. She spread several pencil drawings across his drafting table. What do you think? Graham leaned over them without pretending to be an art expert. One drawing showed the old train station downtown. Another captured a row of narrow brick storefronts beneath a cloudy autumn sky. The third stopped him. It was their house. Not as it actually looked, but as Lila imagined it. The porch light glowed brighter. The flowers were healthier. 3 people stood on the front steps. Not 2. She quietly slid that page underneath the others before he could comment. I still need work on perspective, she muttered. You've gotten better. You always say that. Because it's true. She smiled, though he noticed she never brought the hidden drawing back out. By 8:30 the workshop had settled into its usual rhythm. Sanders measured reclaimed oak beams while Maya finalized permit drawings for another preservation project. Graham was reviewing structural reports when someone knocked lightly against the open warehouse door. Natalie Rowan stepped inside carrying a slim leather portfolio instead of the entourage people usually expected around a CEO. She wore dark jeans, brown boots, and a charcoal coat that looked practical enough to survive an actual construction site. You know, Graham said, glancing toward the empty doorway behind her. Most CEOs travel with at least 3 assistants. They tried. And? I escaped. That earned the smallest laugh from him. Natalie looked around the workshop with genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. You've added shelving. We ran out of places to hide things. She walked toward a century-old stained glass window leaning carefully against a workbench. You repaired this? It'll go back into St. Matthew's Church next month. She traced the air a few inches away from the colored glass but never touched it. You always leave room, she observed. For what? For things that don't belong to you. Graham looked at her for a moment. Restoration isn't about making something mine. No. She nodded slowly. I guess that's why your buildings never lose themselves. The sentence lingered longer than either of them expected. Their meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Most of it revolved around engineering reports, permit revisions, and funding schedules for Riverton's historic courthouse renovation. Yet somehow they also debated whether old maple floors should squeak, argued about the world's best diner pancakes, and disagreed over whether every town needed a bookstore even if nobody made money running one. When Natalie finally stood to leave, she paused beside the workshop door. My board wants the courthouse presentation next Thursday. I'll be there. I was hoping you'd say that. She hesitated only briefly before walking outside. From the second-floor office window, Maya watched the black SUV pull away before looking back at Graham. You know, she said with a grin. She smiles differently when she's here. Graham didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rolled the courthouse blueprints back into their tube with deliberate care. Work was complicated enough. People were even more complicated. And he had spent the last 3 years convincing himself that keeping those two things separate was the safest way to live. By the middle of November, Graham and Natalie had fallen into a routine neither of them had planned. Every Thursday morning, they met at the courthouse before contractors arrived. The building stood at the highest point in Riverton, its limestone columns weathered by more than a century of winters. Graham usually reached the site first, carrying rolled blueprints under one arm and a paper cup of black coffee in the other. Natalie almost always arrived exactly 5 minutes later, somehow managing to look equally comfortable walking through muddy construction zones and corporate boardrooms. Neither of them commented on the pattern. It simply became part of the week. They argued about practical things far more often than personal ones. The original windows stay, Graham insisted. One chilly morning while studying a cracked frame. They're costing us another $80,000. They've survived 112 years. Natalie folded her arms. So your argument is that they're stubborn. My argument is they've already proven they're worth saving. She looked at the window for another moment before smiling. I hate when you make expensive things sound reasonable. You only hate it because I'm right. I didn't say you were. You didn't have to. She laughed quietly, shaking her head before marking another revision onto her tablet. The workers nearby exchanged amused glances. Nobody had ever seen the company's CEO debate building materials with such obvious enjoyment. For Graham, those conversations were easy. The difficult moments happened afterward. Natalie had an annoying habit of remembering small things. If he mentioned that Lila had a science presentation on Friday, she asked about it the following week. If he complained about the coffee from a downtown cafe, she never suggested meeting there again. If he said he preferred handwritten notes over endless emails, she occasionally left comments directly on printed drawings instead of sending another digital message. None of those gestures were dramatic. That was exactly why they unsettled him. One Saturday afternoon, Graham brought Lila to the courthouse after receiving permission from the site manager. She wandered carefully through the unfinished hallways wearing a bright yellow safety helmet that kept slipping over her eyes. "So this is where you work?" she asked Natalie. Natalie smiled. "Sometimes. Dad says buildings have stories." "They do. Do you believe that?" Natalie looked toward Graham before answering. "I think people leave pieces of themselves inside the places they care about." Lila considered that seriously. "Then my dad must be everywhere." Graham rolled his eyes. "Don't encourage her. I'm just agreeing with her." Lila wandered toward one of the restored courtrooms where sunlight poured through tall windows, leaving long rectangles of light across the polished floor. "This room feels—" She paused, searching for the word. "Peaceful." Graham looked around. A month earlier the room had been covered in dust and temporary scaffolding. Now it felt alive again. "I guess that's why Dad likes fixing old things," Lila continued. "He thinks broken doesn't always mean finished." Neither adult answered immediately. Natalie watched Graham instead. There was something different about him whenever his daughter was nearby. He smiled more easily. He listened longer. He never looked at his phone while she was talking. The guarded man she usually met during meetings quietly disappeared. Later, as they walked toward the parking lot, Lila climbed into Graham's pickup while Natalie waited beside her SUV. "I've been meaning to ask," she said. "What? Does Lila know you're impossible to convince once you've made up your mind?" "She reminds me almost daily." "I believe that." A comfortable silence settled between them. Cars rolled slowly past beneath trees glowing orange and red. Finally Natalie spoke again. "There's a community orchestra performing downtown Friday night." Graham looked at her. "I have 2 extra tickets." She immediately added, "No pressure." He knew exactly what she was asking. It wasn't really about the concert. It was about spending time together somewhere that wasn't covered in blueprints and construction dust. His first instinct was to say yes. His second was louder. "Lila and I already have plans," he answered gently. It wasn't entirely untrue. Friday nights belonged to pizza, old movies, and whatever ridiculous board game Lila wanted to win that week. Natalie nodded with the same calm expression she always carried. "Maybe another time." "Maybe." She smiled politely before climbing into her vehicle. As Graham watched her drive away, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he had just declined something much larger than an evening concert. Not because he didn't want to go. Because wanting to go was exactly what frightened him. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected. By sunrise, Riverton's rooftops wore a thin white layer, and the courthouse courtyard looked almost untouched except for a single set of footprints leading toward the east entrance. Graham brushed the snow from his coat before stepping inside. The old heating system hummed somewhere beneath the marble floors, struggling against the cold. Natalie was already there. She stood near one of the restored windows, studying the morning light filtering through the original stained glass. "I was beginning to think architects hibernated in winter," she said without turning around. "We only move slower. You've definitely mastered that." He smiled as he unrolled the latest construction drawings across a temporary table. For the next hour they worked almost without interruption, comparing stone samples and reviewing reinforcement plans for the courthouse's aging foundation. Their conversations moved naturally between measurements and memories, deadlines and small jokes that no one else in the room would have understood. Around noon, Graham's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and immediately answered. Hey, Bug. Natalie quietly stepped away, giving him privacy. Lila sounded unusually excited. Dad! Guess what? What happened? Our art teacher nominated me for the State Young Artists Showcase. His face lit up. That's incredible. But, her voice softened. The registration fee is $400. Graham leaned against one of the old stone columns. When's the deadline? Friday. I'll figure it out. You always do. After hanging up, he stood silently for a moment. $400 wasn't impossible. It just meant delaying the replacement of 2 workshop machines that had been failing for months. He had already decided which expense could wait. Natalie returned carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. You look like someone just handed you a puzzle. Lila was nominated for an art showcase. That's wonderful. It is. But? He hesitated. There isn't really a but. She studied him carefully but didn't press. Instead, she handed him the coffee. I've learned that when people say there isn't a but, there usually is. He chuckled. I'll manage. I don't doubt that. The subject ended there. Or so Graham believed. 2 days later, Friday afternoon arrived with a cold rain that replaced the week's snow. Graham picked Lila up from school, expecting the usual flood of stories about classmates and teachers. Instead, she climbed into the truck holding an envelope with both hands. Her eyes were wide. Dad? What is it? She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was an official acceptance packet for the showcase. Attached to it was another letter. It informed her that an anonymous donor had covered the entire registration fee along with transportation costs. Lila stared at the page in disbelief. I didn't even apply for financial help. Either of them spoke for several seconds. Then she looked at Graham with complete certainty. You did this, didn't you? He frowned. No. But who else would? Graham took the letter from her and read it again. There was no name. No signature. Only one sentence at the bottom. Your talent deserves every opportunity to grow. He folded the paper slowly. Somewhere deep inside, before he had a single piece of evidence, one thought quietly settled into place. He knew exactly who might have believed she was helping. Graham waited until Monday. Not because he needed time to calm down. Because he refused to accuse someone based on a feeling. The anonymous donation letter stayed folded inside the front pocket of his notebook all weekend. Every few hours, he found himself taking it out, reading the same sentence, then putting it away again. Your talent deserves every opportunity to grow. It sounded generous. It also sounded dangerously familiar. Monday morning brought freezing rain instead of snow. Workers hurried through the courthouse carrying lumber and electrical equipment, while the sound of nail guns echoed from the upper floors. Natalie was already reviewing revised budgets with 2 project managers when Graham arrived. She looked up and smiled. Morning. Can we talk? The smile remained, but she noticed something different in his voice. Of course. She excused herself from the meeting, leading him into a quiet room that would eventually become the courthouse library. For now, it contained little more than folding chairs, unfinished bookshelves, and the scent of fresh plaster. Either of them sat down. Graham placed the envelope on the windowsill between them. Lila received this Friday. Natalie looked at it without touching it. I heard she was accepted. Did you? She deserves it. He nodded slowly. Did you pay the registration fee? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she was searching for an excuse. Because she was deciding whether honesty would make things better or worse. Yes. The word landed softly. No drama. No defensiveness. I asked the foundation office to process it anonymously. Graham closed his eyes for a brief moment. I thought anonymity would make it easier. She continued. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I know. I just... She searched for the right words. Didn't want a 12-year-old to lose an opportunity over $400. Graham leaned against the unfinished wall, crossing his arms. You know what she asked me? Natalie's expression shifted. No. She thought I had arranged it. Silence settled over the room. When I told her I hadn't, she looked confused. He looked directly at Natalie. She has spent 3 years watching me teach her that if we need help, we ask honestly. If we earn something, we earn it openly. He tapped the envelope gently. Now she thinks invisible people solve problems before she even knows they exist. Natalie's shoulders lowered. I didn't think of it that way. I know you didn't. Then why are you looking at me like I broke something? Because you did. The words weren't sharp. That somehow made them heavier. You took away a conversation I should have had with my daughter. Natalie felt that sentence more deeply than anything else he had said. She had expected him to be angry about pride, money, independence. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't realized she had stepped into the private space between a father and his child. I can cancel it. He shook his head immediately. No. Then tell me how to fix this. You can't. She frowned. There isn't always a fix. Outside, workers laughed over something in the hallway before the sounds faded again. Natalie spoke quietly. My entire career has been solving problems. I believe that. If someone needs funding, I understand. I find funding. If someone needs resources, I know. If someone's carrying too much alone. She stopped herself. I help. Graham looked at the rain sliding down the unfinished window. My wife used to say almost the same thing. Natalie waited. After she died. He continued. People showed up every week. He smiled without humor. Meals. Donations. Advice. Babysitting schedules I never asked for. They meant well. They absolutely did. He turned back toward her. But after a while, his voice became quieter. I realized everyone was making decisions for us because they thought they knew what we needed. Natalie didn't interrupt. I promised myself that Lila would grow up seeing me solve our problems, even when the solution wasn't perfect. He picked up the envelope. You weren't trying to buy gratitude. No. You weren't trying to impress me. No. You were trying to protect a little girl. Yes. He nodded once. And that's exactly why this is so hard. Natalie's eyes dropped to the floor. For perhaps the first time in years, she understood that good intentions could leave damage behind without anyone raising their voice. When Graham reached the doorway, he paused. I'm stepping back from the courthouse project for a while. Natalie looked up. What? Maya will finish the restoration work. Graham. This isn't punishment. He met her eyes one last time. It's distance. Before she could answer, he walked into the hallway, leaving the unfinished library quieter than it had been before either of them entered. Natalie remained where she was, staring at the empty doorway. For the first time in a very long time, she couldn't solve the problem in front of her. Because this one wasn't asking for money. It was asking for restraint. 3 days passed. Graham threw himself into work with the quiet determination of a man trying to convince himself that routine could solve almost anything. He inspected roof trusses, reviewed engineering reports, spent an entire afternoon teaching a young apprentice how to repair century-old oak trim without replacing more wood than necessary. None of it kept his mind from wandering. Every Thursday morning for nearly 4 months, he had expected to drive to the courthouse. Thursday came. He drove somewhere else. Lila noticed before he said a word. You aren't going downtown today. It wasn't a question. He glanced at her across the breakfast table. No. She buttered a piece of toast, watching him carefully. You and Ms. Rowan had a fight? We didn't fight. You stopped seeing each other. We worked together. You liked working together. He smiled faintly. You sound older than 12. I have eyes. That almost made him laugh. Almost. Meanwhile, Natalie discovered something she had never experienced in 20 years of leading companies. She couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. You took away a conversation I should have had with my daughter. Her executive assistant placed 3 folders on her desk that morning. Natalie opened none of them. Instead, she called the director of the Rowan Community Foundation. I need to know exactly how the Mercer donation was processed. It followed your authorization. I know. There was a pause. I want every document. An hour later, the paperwork covered her conference table. She read each page slowly. Application waived. Registration approved. Transportation arranged. Accommodation reserved. Everything had been solved before Graham even knew there had been a problem. It looked efficient. Professional. Thoughtful. Looking at it now, she saw something entirely different. Not one document contained a place asking whether Lila's father wanted help. Not one line asked for permission. The realization sat heavily in the room. She had spent years building systems designed to remove obstacles. She had never questioned whether removing every obstacle also removed someone else's right to face it. Late that afternoon, she drove to Riverton High School, parking across the street just as students poured through the front entrance. She had no intention of speaking to Graham. She simply wanted to return something. The showcase packet. She had requested the foundation reverse the anonymous sponsorship before any funds were released. Instead, the foundation board had unanimously rejected her request. Their explanation had been simple. The scholarship committee had independently reviewed Lila's portfolio after receiving Natalie's recommendation. They believed the artwork deserved support regardless of who suggested it. For the first time, Natalie had been overruled inside her own foundation. She accepted it. Not because she agreed. Because forcing them to reverse the decision would repeat the same mistake. She remained inside her SUV as students crossed the parking lot. Then she saw Lila. The girl was carrying a cardboard model of the courthouse wrapped carefully in plastic. She walked beside an older art teacher who pointed toward tiny architectural details on the model. Lila smiled with genuine pride. Natalie realized something that made her chest tighten. That model had nothing to do with the scholarship. Nothing to do with money. Nothing to do with her. The talent was already there. She hadn't created an opportunity. She had simply assumed she needed to. Across town, Graham received an unexpected visitor. Maya stepped into his office holding several courthouse drawings. The project review is tomorrow. I know. They're struggling. They'll figure it out. She set the drawings on his desk. They're not struggling because of engineering. He looked up. They're struggling because nobody argues with Natalie anymore. He frowned. What does that have to do with me? You were the only person who disagreed with her without trying to impress her. Maya folded her arms. You never noticed, did you? Noticed what? She didn't come to your workshop because she needed an architect. Graham remained silent. She came because, for a few hours every week, someone treated her like she was just Natalie. After Maya left, the office grew unusually quiet. Graham looked through the window toward the workshop floor below. He had spent days replaying what Natalie had done. For the first time, he forced himself to replay why she had done it. The answer didn't excuse the mistake. But it made the person who made it much harder to walk away from. The following Monday, Natalie walked into the Foundation's monthly board meeting carrying nothing except a legal pad and a decision she had spent the entire weekend making. Usually, she entered with a polished presentation and a list of approvals waiting for signatures. This time, she closed the conference room door behind her and remained standing. I have one item before we begin. 8 board members looked up. I want to change how this foundation operates. The room fell quiet. Natalie looked around the table before continuing. We've spent years measuring success by how quickly we remove obstacles. Several people nodded. She shook her head. That's no longer enough. The board's legal advisor frowned. What are you proposing? A consent policy. Nobody spoke. From now on, Natalie continued, if an applicant has a parent or legal guardian capable of making decisions, we don't intervene privately. We ask first. One board member leaned forward. But that slows everything down. It does. We could lose opportunities. We also stop taking decisions away from families. A silence settled over the room. Natalie knew exactly where that sentence had come from. She wasn't quoting Graham. She was finally understanding him. The policy wasn't approved immediately. Questions filled the next hour. Concerns. Budget implications. Emergency exceptions. By the end of the meeting, they voted to rewrite the Foundation's procedures before approving another anonymous sponsorship. For the first time in years, Natalie left without feeling like she had won. She left feeling like she had learned. Across town, Graham was standing inside the courthouse for the first time since stepping away from the project. Not because he had returned. Because the city inspector requested clarification on one structural report only he had prepared months earlier. He expected to answer a few technical questions and leave. Instead, he found half the project team arguing around a conference table. The replacement stone won't match. We're already over budget. The contractor wants an answer today. Voices overlapped until Natalie quietly entered the room. Everyone stopped talking. She looked at Graham for only a second before addressing the team. Mr. Mercer is here as the original consulting architect. No special introduction. No extra authority. No attempt to persuade him to stay. She simply placed his drawings on the table. Would you walk us through your recommendations? Nothing more. For a brief moment Graham simply looked at her. A month earlier she would have answered every question herself. Now she stepped back and took notes, while he explained the restoration sequence. When one contractor interrupted him, Natalie didn't finish his sentence. She waited. When another executive looked toward her for approval, she answered calmly. Let's hear Graham's complete recommendation first. That small decision changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Nobody rushed him. Nobody deferred to Natalie. The discussion became exactly what it should have been. Professional. After nearly 90 minutes, the inspector approved Graham's original structural plan with only minor revisions. People gathered their folders and gradually filtered out of the conference room until only Graham and Natalie remained. Neither spoke immediately. Finally Graham broke the silence. You handled that differently. She nodded. I've been practicing. He smiled, almost without realizing it. I noticed. Natalie rested both hands lightly on the back of an empty chair. I owe you something. You don't owe me anything. I owe you an apology. She met his eyes without looking away. I wasn't wrong because I cared. She paused. I was wrong because I decided what caring should look like before asking what you actually needed. The room remained perfectly still. I've spent my whole career believing leadership meant solving problems faster than everyone else. A faint smile crossed her face. You taught me that sometimes leadership means waiting long enough for someone else to choose. Graham looked toward the courthouse windows where late afternoon sunlight spilled across the restored wooden floor. I wasn't completely fair either. She looked at him. I assumed your help came from the same place as everyone else's. And it didn't? No. He shook his head slowly. It came from someone who genuinely believed she was protecting my daughter. For the first time since the anonymous donation, neither of them was defending themselves. They were simply telling the truth. Outside church. Bells echoed across downtown Riverton as workers packed away their tools. The courthouse no longer felt like the place where they had drifted apart. For the first time, it felt like the place where they had both begun changing. December arrived with the kind of sharp morning air that made every breath visible. The courthouse restoration was entering its final phase. Scaffolding had come down from the front entrance, polished oak doors had been rehung, and sunlight once again spilled through the restored stained glass windows Graham's team had spent weeks preserving. Only one major decision remained. The City Council, the Investors, Preservation Committee, and Rowan Urban Development's Executive Board gathered in the restored courtroom to approve the final interior budget. Graham sat halfway down the long table as an independent consulting architect. Not beside Natalie. Not across from her. Simply where his role belonged. Natalie entered a few minutes later carrying nothing but a thin folder. For the first time since anyone could remember, she wasn't accompanied by assistants. The meeting began smoothly. Engineering reports, safety certifications, accessibility compliance. Everything pointed toward unanimous approval. Then one of the private investors cleared his throat. There is one remaining issue. A projector illuminated a revised financial proposal. If we replace the restored oak benches with modern seating, remove several custom restoration elements, and simplify the public archive room, we save nearly $600,000. Several executives nodded. One council member asked, "Would visitors even notice?" "They wouldn't." Another investor smiled. "The public appreciates appearance more than authenticity." Graham quietly studied the revised drawings. They weren't unsafe. They weren't ugly. They simply erased the very details that made the building itself. One executive turned toward Natalie. "This is your call." Months earlier, everyone in the room already knew what would have happened. Natalie would have made the decision. Everyone else would have followed. Instead, she closed the proposal without opening it. "I'd like to hear our consulting." "Architect first." Several heads turned toward Graham. He looked surprised. "You don't need my permission," he said. "No," Natalie answered calmly. "But they deserve your expertise." The room became still. Graham stood, walked toward the projection screen, and quietly replaced the revised rendering with one of the original restoration plans. He didn't speak dramatically. He simply pointed to several architectural details. This molding was carved in 1913 by local craftsmen. He moved to another image. These benches were built from white oak harvested less than 20 miles from here. Another photograph appeared. This archive room isn't decorative. It tells visitors why this courthouse mattered to generations before us. He looked around the room. If saving money means removing the building's memory. He paused. Then we're preserving walls, not history. No one interrupted. Not because he spoke loudly. Because every sentence came from someone who had spent months earning the right to say it. When he finished, silence settled across the courtroom. The investor finally turned toward Natalie. "Well?" She folded her hands together. "My opinion doesn't matter more than the work presented." He frowned. "You're the CEO. I am. And leadership isn't deciding everything." She looked around the table. "It's making sure the best decision survives the discussion." The city council chairperson slowly nodded. "I move we approve the original restoration plan." Another member immediately seconded the motion. One by one, hands were raised around the room. The revised cost-cutting proposal quietly disappeared without another word. As people gathered their papers, one executive approached Natalie. "You could have pushed your own recommendation." "I didn't have one." "You always do." She smiled. "Not anymore." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflected softly across the fresh snow covering the courthouse steps. Workers loaded their final equipment into trucks. The project that had consumed nearly a year was finally coming to an end. Graham stood alone near the front entrance, watching families wander through the public square. Natalie joined him a few moments later. Neither rushed to fill the silence. Finally she spoke. "I almost interrupted you 3 times. He laughed quietly. "I noticed. It was surprisingly difficult. I imagine." She looked toward the restored courthouse. "For years I thought people trusted me because I always had answers. And now? I think they trust me more when they know I'll listen first." Graham nodded. "I learned something too." She waited. "I've spent years believing that accepting help meant giving away control." He looked at the courthouse doors opening for the first visitors. "Turns out the real danger wasn't accepting help. It was assuming I had to carry everything alone." Natalie didn't move closer. She didn't reach for his hand. She simply stood beside him, sharing the quiet without trying to shape it into anything more. For the first time since they had met, either of them was trying to protect the other from making a choice. They were simply giving each other the freedom to make one. The courthouse reopened on the first Saturday of January. Fresh snow lined the sidewalks, But inside, the old building felt warm again. Families wandered through the restored hallways, retired judges pointed out details they remembered from decades ago, and children pressed their hands against the polished oak railings that had been carefully repaired instead of replaced. No banners celebrated a corporation. No giant plaques carried anyone's name. The building simply belonged to the town again. Graham arrived with Lila just after noon. She wore a navy wool coat, a knitted scarf Hannah had made years before, and carried a small sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. "You think they'll remember you?" she teased. "I'm hoping they remember the building." "They will." She slipped her hand through his arm as they climbed the courthouse steps together. Inside the main courtroom, volunteers guided visitors through exhibits explaining the restoration process. Old photographs hung beside new ones, showing how years of patient work had brought forgotten craftsmanship back to life. Lila stopped in front of one display. "Dad?" He joined her. A small caption beneath one photograph read, "Original. Restoration completed through collaboration between local craftsmen, preservation specialists, city officials, and community partners." There were no oversized portraits. No single person claimed the achievement. Lila smiled. "I like this." "So do I. It doesn't sound like one hero saved everything." Graham looked around the room. "Because that's usually not how real life works." Across the hall, Natalie was quietly speaking with several city council members before noticing Graham and Lila. She excused herself and walked over. For a brief second, all three simply smiled. No awkwardness. No uncertainty. Only familiarity earned over months of difficult conversations. Lila held up her sketchbook. "I finally finished it." Natalie carefully accepted it. Inside was a watercolor painting of the courthouse during the first snowfall. The restored windows reflected warm light onto the snowy street. 3 tiny figures stood near the entrance. One wore a yellow scarf. One carried blueprints. One held a sketchbook. Natalie's eyes lingered on the painting. "It's beautiful." Lila shrugged. "I painted people smaller." "Why?" "So the building stays the most important part." Graham laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like your father." Natalie closed the sketchbook gently. "I'd like to buy a print when you're famous." Lila grinned. "No discounts." "Fair enough." They all laughed. Later that afternoon, visitors slowly drifted home as the winter sun settled lower behind the old courthouse tower. Graham and Natalie stood outside watching children throw handfuls of snow across the public square. A reporter nearby smiled at them. "So," she pointed playfully between them, "people around town have been wondering for months." Graham looked toward Natalie. Months earlier, he would have found a way to dodge the question. To make a joke. To build another careful wall. Instead, he smiled. "I used to worry people would think we were together." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Graham glanced at Natalie before answering. "Now I think what matters is whether we treat each other with honesty and respect." Natalie smiled. "I couldn't have said it better." She didn't reach for his hand. Neither of them felt the need to perform a perfect ending for anyone watching. They simply walked down the courthouse steps side by side, matching each other's pace without either person leading. It felt ordinary. That was exactly what made it meaningful. As someone looking at their story from the outside, I don't believe its lesson was ever about a successful CEO meeting a single father. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about status. It wasn't about who had more influence. It was about 2 people learning that respect cannot be replaced by generosity, and love cannot grow where one person's voice quietly disappears. Too often, people decide someone's worth by a job title, a bank account, the clothes they wear, or the neighborhood they live in. Those judgments have always been shallow. Whether a person is wealthy or struggling, successful or just getting by, every human being deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to be seen for who they truly are. Being poor does not make someone less valuable. Being rich does not make someone more deserving of love. Character, humility, kindness, and the willingness to listen will always matter more than status. Perhaps that was the real restoration completed inside the old courthouse. Not the windows. Not the woodwork. Not the stone. But two hearts that stopped trying to protect themselves long enough to treat each other as equals. And sometimes, that is the strongest foundation anyone can build.